Hear me all right?
Hi, you're here with the Institute of Building, and we have got for you today our Industry Insights webinar on NZS 3910. Now today it is interactive. We've got 4 wonderful guests, but we also ask you to post your questions on Slido. You can see the code at the bottom there, 4169979. We've got 45 minutes with our wonderful panel of experts, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves coming up. First of all, let's start with David Wilkie. David, tell us about your role in this institute. Oh,
Kia ora tātou. I'm David Wilkie. I'm a director of TSA in my day job, which most of my history in the last 30 years has been as a project manager and as an engineer of the contract and as an engineer's rep. My role on this project has been to chair the committee of 23 very talented individuals to prepare the draft, which has been a great challenge and a great delight, I have to say.
Thanks, David. And next we'll go to Natasha Pozniski.
Hi there. I'm Natasha. I own my own construction consultancy, Urban Outcomes Limited, and I undertake the role and specialise in the independent engineer, generally working with other organisations as engineers rep. I was nominated to be on the panel by NZIOB, and so have been really enjoying being part of the review panel of 3910.
Awesome. Thanks, Natasha. And now we'll go to John, also known as Johnny Malthus.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm a director at LT McGuinness. I've been a contracts manager here for 20 odd years and builder at LT's prior to that. And I was NZIOB representative, really representing main contractors in the journey.
Wonderful, thank you. And on to John Hemi.
Kia ora tātou, ko John Hemi tōku ingoa. So John Hemi is my name. I'm the Director of Construction Productivity at the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission, also known as Te Waihanga. My background is working for the main contractor for most of my career, but for the last 2 and a bit years, I've been in the government working for the Commission out of Wellington. So nice to be here.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you very much. We're really, really impressed to be able to have the chair and our 3 representatives, including someone, John, from Te Waihanga, in terms of kicking this off alongside the Construction Sector Accord. Now, we know this has been going for a couple of years and we're curious about a bit of context. So we're going to go first to David Wilkie to tell us about why this is happening now and what we needed to know about the forming up and setting up of this review.
Thanks, Pam. So the process for review of 3910-2013 started in about 2019 when Tash was involved with the authoring of a report which was about the use of the contract within the public sector primarily. And it's an excellent report. Recommend you have a read of that if you're interested. They followed a number of workshops that scoped up the changes that the industry anticipated was needed to take to 3910 to improve it. And some of the things that sort of were really clear was that the number of specials and the proliferation of special conditions that were coming into the market since the 2013 edition was evidence that change was required. Now, the document hadn't kept pace with legislative change. There was a number of key issues from the scoping workshops around the lack of collaboration, and in particular, the construction accords objectives were not really anticipated or met by the 2013 edition. And there was a lot of conversation around the role of the engineer and the perceived bias and the conflict and the dual role and the mistrust of the industry with the engineer to the contracts role. There was concern about time bars, there was concern about caps on liabilities, and quite a long list of other issues that the industry asked the committee or the sponsors to review in the current edition. So in terms of how the process took place, in February of last year, the committee was formed, and there were 23 voting members on the committee, and those members came from a range of organisations who nominated members. NZIOB was one of those and nominated 3 members, and or possibly more, but certainly 3 made it onto the committee. But there's quantity surveyors, there were vertical constructors, horizontal constructors, principals from the private sector, principals from the public sector, project managers, lawyers, adjudicators, a wide range. So my role was as chair, and we formed in February, as I said, and the groups met 12 times as a full committee. And I would say too that the participation on the committees were largely volunteer. It was almost entirely individuals giving their time through their organisations for the benefit of the community. So there were very few people paid to participate in this. The working groups, which there were 5, met sometimes weekly between February last year and December. And as I said, the committee met a dozen times for over a dozen days. So it's a significant investment in time and effort from your colleagues and around the industry. Lots of debate, very healthy debate. But one of the early principles that we established was that, look, if we can't agree on something, then we will stick with the status quo. We didn't often get to that place, but sometimes we did. And I have to say that I'm pretty proud of the way that the committees work together and the way it's been very collaborative. And if that's an indication of the health of the industry, then the industry is in good health. Pam, would you like me just to run through perhaps some of the outline of the major changes?
I think we'll get to that in a moment, but thank you, David. It's really clear that there's a huge spirit of generosity. A massive amount of time has gone into this. And so it's great that we've got this opportunity to thank you in the first instance. We know the work's not over and that it's now, the draft has entered a consultation period, which we understand goes till the end of June. Just in terms of setting up the reasons for doing this, Natasha, you kindly have shared with us the Urban Outcomes website and the Infracom report handle. We'll make sure that that information is shared in the notes. This website is being recorded, will be available through the Institute of Buildings resources tab, as well as on YouTube. And of course, this precedes the conversation that's happening tomorrow, which is with the Construction Sector Accord in Te Waihanga, tomorrow being Tuesday, 23rd of May, and that's at 3 p.m. And there's a free registration to that. I assume that will also be recorded and available at some point. But if we can just ask, Natasha, you were involved with this report a number of years ago. Is there anything you would add in terms of the context or why now for updating 3910?
When I was first asked to research the Advisian report, it was through the Infrastructure Transaction Unit, and it came at a time when the industry had seen a lot of large contractors suffer. We'd seen NZIOB and Fletcher's lose significant amounts of money, and obviously NZIOB ceased trading. And I think particularly in the case of Fletcher Construction, a lot of those projects where they had suffered significant losses were through public sector. So the Infrastructure Transaction Unit asked for a report into how the public sector were contracting under 3910. And at the same time that that report was being researched, the Construction Sector Accord was being stood up in response to the issues we were seeing in the industry. And off the back of that, the Infrastructure Commission. So it came at a time when the industry was going through quite a bit of turmoil, and I think a joined government approach was trying to get to the bottom of how we could all help. And off the back of that report, there were other reports at the same time as well. The Construction Sector Accord and New Zealand Standards held some larger scoping sessions. I would say there would be 50 or 60 people in the room for those to try and establish our approach to 3910. As David said, that report identified that people were using, in some cases, hundreds of pages of special conditions and transferring large amounts of risk, and not only on large projects, but a lot of government agencies, their projects can be under $1 million, 80% of them. So we were seeing that level of special conditions on smaller projects as well. And that was really a catalyst, I think, for the industry to look at what it was doing and at the same time look at the contract conditions.
Great. So the scene was set. We wanted a more efficient and productive means of contracting. Well, now we're on the other side of all that huge amount of work and we have this draft. David, in your position as chair, how would you summarise, and I'm fully aware that these are broad and far-reaching results, but how would you summarise some of the key changes that the industry will expect to see?
Thanks, Pam. Well, you're right. I mean, it's hard to summarise it. There are, if you pick up the consultation documents, there are actually two documents up. There's a clean version of the draft standard, which is clean, and then there's a compare version which compares the new draft with the previous. And if you look at the compare, it's a sea of red and blue, and it's a bit frightening, but it's actually not as frightening as it is in reality. One of the big changes, but I characterize it as saying it has attempted to update the standard document, the standard, to reflect what I think the committee would consider industry best practice when it comes to contracting. It is about rebalancing and repealing some of the perhaps the imbalance that was in the document in terms of risk and obligations and preconditions. There are some new terms introduced, particularly we've rewritten the indemnification and we've added in a limitation on liability clause, which we think is better. There's just some simple things. Here's a couple of one-liners that you'll remember. The word offsite overheads and profit no longer exists. We've replaced it with P&G, sorry, with margin. And the term on-site overheads, it no longer exists. We've replaced it with P&G. So those, I mean, they're small things, but they reflect the way that the language that the industry uses to communicate. And there's quite a lot of that throughout the document. We've added an order of precedence into the contract agreement, and we haven't actually added in a section on collaborative practices because we've rewritten a lot of the clauses that encourage collaborative practices. So there are, rather than requesting a review, a lot of the content requests the parties to seek to agree first before requesting a decision. There are reciprocal obligations on the contractor and the principal. So for instance, under what was called 521 advance notifications, that was all about the contractor having to notify the principal if there are any circumstances that may affect the due date for completion or contract price. Now we've changed that so that the principal also has that obligation. So they are required to notify the contractor if something changes. One of the big, but there are lots of tweaks and changes throughout. It is about improving the document, making it more readable, better navigation. But there is one very significant change, which Tash will talk more about, which is that the engineer of the contract role has been removed and the engineer's representative role has been removed. So I think maybe that's probably a good time for me to stop talking and Tash can pick up on that one.
Great. Yes, we're very lucky to have three different perspectives that we'll hear from now. Natasha, an engineer for the contract, Johnny being a main contractor, and John from the government as client perspective. So Natasha, can you kick us off and tell us about the changes from your perspective and your role?
Yes, well, obviously the biggest change from my role and my perspective is the removal of the engineer term, and that was one of the things that came through very strongly when I was researching the report, was this conflict or perceived conflict of interest with the engineer to the contract and acting as an expert advisor to the principal whilst also having to make independent decisions. So that conflict, we believe, has been removed in this draft, and we now have 2 new roles, which is the contract administrator, which I'll refer to as CA, and the contract administrator is a natural person who will act for and on behalf of the principal. They will be responsible for issuing contract instructions, and generally they will do the role that you often see when you have an independent engineer delegating down to the engineer's rep, or a more senior person acting as the engineer, delegating a lot of the day-to-day tasks down to the engineer's rep. So as David said, we're trying to reflect what happens actually day-to-day, and a contract administrator, we believed, was appropriate to in the contract to highlight those day-to-day activities and show that one person generally undertakes that role. And then the independent certifier, IC, is a natural person, and they are required under the contract to act fairly impartially and independently, and they will make decisions under the contract, and that's a new term under the contract as well, decisions. There's only one point in the contract where they act as an agent to the principal, and that's in the payment claim process. So in that process, they will receive the claim on behalf of the principal, and they will incorporate any principal's deductions. So that's as things happen now, and that is the only point in the contract where they will act as an agent on behalf of the principal. And that expert advisor role for that person has been removed. There's a couple of key points that I just wanted to highlight in relation to that change. The extension of time process, for instance, there's now a process where the contract administrator and the contractor can try and reach agreement on an extension of time before it would go to a formal decision. If they can't reach agreement, then it would be escalated to the independent certifier to make a decision. Any acceleration under the contract would be managed and instructed by the contract administrator. So again, just keeping that independent certifier at the very high impartial decision-making level. And the other key change, which we spent a lot of time on, which people may or may not, when they read it, think it's a change to the process, but we as a committee spent a lot of time on it, was the review process, so under 6.4. And because the contract administrator is now the person issuing the instructions, if you are unhappy, if someone's unhappy with that instruction that's been issued, it gets escalated to the independent certifier. So the first review of that instruction is actually at the moment you're reviewing your own decision, and that creates a lot of concern is raised about that. So the first step in that process now is the independent certifier reviewing the contract administrator's decision. It then goes through a review process again, and it's worthwhile just taking some time to look at that clause, I think. Other than that, there's a couple of other introduction of terms that I just wanted to highlight. One is that we've introduced a principal's representative, so that it's very clear who from the principal's side should receive documents, notices, and can make a decision on behalf of the principal. And we've also introduced the term advisors, so that it's clear who is advising either the contract administrator or the independent certifier. For instance, a quantity surveyor is often advising the independent certifier on, or the engineer currently, on payment claim processes. So we're now naming those as, and they're in the mix of the contract as advisors. So I think from my perspective, that is a big change for the role that I do. It's important to also note that the independent certifier and the contract administrator can be the same person. The reason that is the case is because we do have to acknowledge that maybe 70% or more of NZS3910 contracts are under quite small contracts. So under 2 million, under 5 million. And on those, we can't expect that the principal's going to want to employ 2 or 3 different people. So I often will do smaller projects and I act as quantity surveyor, engineer's rep engineer. And I think it's important that people still have the ability to do that on those smaller projects, or it just becomes unfeasible. But the key differential is that the independent certifier role is clearly an independent role in the contract. And when someone's undertaking that role, they can clearly say, I'm doing it in this guise as independent certifier. I have no obligation as an expert advisor to the principal in that role, and I'm acting independently.
Great.
That's me.
Thanks, Natasha. That's a fantastic summary and good to see some interesting changes there. Johnny, how would you follow that up, and from a main contractor's perspective, what are the key changes from your view?
Look, I would sort of state by saying, look, generally the NZS3910 is a good document and it served the industry well for many decades. But look, it was getting a bit tired, and it is used across a huge number of contracts. And I think that's something we really, as a committee, had to always be mindful of. It'll do small, simple contracts to contracts worth $1 billion, both vertically and horizontally with infrastructure projects. Therefore, as David mentioned, the committee was a good cross-section of our industry, from the client side, developers, government, local authorities, builders, subcontractors, designers, lawyers. We've all got a different bias on that. And a lot of work was done around trying to make changes with a background of reasonableness and fairness to all parties. I think when one reads through the document, you wonder why lots of little things have been tweaked, but virtually every clause was gone over with a fine-tooth comb and weighted on its fairness and its reasonableness, which has been a humongous job, really. One also needs to understand that this document cannot account for a change for bad behaviours or by anyone who's a party to the contract, either contractor, client, principal, EOT, etc. And with this sort of, as by way of background, the last issue for main contractors, I believe, has always been around the impartiality of the engineer to the contract, and also reflecting the increasingly common practices Tasha mentioned around splitting out the administration side of the contract away from the actual engineer to the contract for quite logical reasons, and importantly, the new document changes will reflect these. As you mentioned before, we've now clearly defined the 2 separate roles: engineer to the contract becoming independent certifier, and a contract administrator becoming just that. Thus, the roles can be split between 2 separate consultancies or not, depending on the size and nature of the contract. I'm optimistic that going forward, the traditional engineer to the contract, or proposed independent certifier, as they'll now be known, will increasingly become an experienced, independent professional role away from the design consultants and the client's project managers and other advisors, which for contractors is definitely a good thing. Other sort of more changes in the document, we've changed a bit of the document around to reflect current tech changes. So, the practice of using electronic documents is now allowed in the contract. More clarity has been given around things like shop drawing and the shop drawing process and the requirements of contractor design elements. The perennial battle of risk transfer and time bars have been discussed at length. And I think an overall improvement, at best, in fairness around these has been achieved or clarified across a multitude of clauses. You really do need to read the whole document to understand what's changed. Also, under section 2.5, we've added a new thing called a target price as another form of setting a contract value, in addition to the traditional lump sum measure and value and cost reimbursement. We've made a few changes to reflect legislative changes, like around health and safety, and payments and retentions, to reflect the changes which are about to be passed, particularly around retentions, and also some liability caps and the like have been changed. From a contractor perspective, I didn't give that we wanted, I don't think. Like it'd be great if we could actually tell, have written in the document that by the 20th of the month, the contractor shall be paid. But that's not going to happen, I don't think. But I can make a submission and do that during the public consultation process, as I would encourage other main contractors to do. But look, I think overall the changes that we've made are fair and reasonable and present an improvement on the present contract document. And I'd encourage everyone who's got the time to take it out, have a read. It's important to our industry, and make your own submissions and form your own views. And that's
Thanks,
kind of where
Thanks,
I see
Johnny.
it.
Yeah, that last point was really interesting. And of course, this is your opportunity to speak directly to Institute members around the points that the main contractors should be submitting on. Is there anything else you would add or stress, given that you have that floor now?
Not at this time. Look, I think everyone needs to form their own views, but I think your view needs to be balanced around, I think one of the neat things about most of the people that sat around the table is many of us have sat on, many of us have been client reps, been the client, or been designers, or work for contractors. So there was it's the balance is what we were setting to achieve, and setting risk and other things at a reasonable level. So it's fairly a proportion, and the risk sits where it should sit. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Thank you, Johnny. John, in terms of where you sit at Te Waihanga, can you tell us a little bit? Obviously, you've been involved throughout the whole process, but where do you think things have landed for government's role as client?
Thanks, Pam. I'd just like to start with a headline. New Zealand needs to be building better infrastructure and be better at building it. And a little bit about Te Waihanga and who we are. So Te Waihanga is a autonomous Crown entity, and our principal role is to be the principal advisor to the Minister on all things related to infrastructure. And for us, that includes social infrastructure like schools, hospitals, prisons, and social housing. We've got three groups. So we've got policy, strategy, and infrastructure delivery, which is where I am, and two key legislated outputs, and that's a 30-year infrastructure strategy that was published about 9 months or a year ago, and the government has just released its action plan responding to the 68 recommendations that are in the Te Waihanga strategy document. The other legislated output is the infrastructure pipeline. So the infrastructure pipeline has all of the projects that we're confident will get funding and proceed, and they allow planning and resource needs to be mapped out. And that's a key tool that's being used in the response to the North Island weather events at the moment. There's a big program going on with the Accord looking at what the resource implications of that additional very localized, in some cases, work is. So the key thing that the key way Te Waihanga help New Zealand build better infrastructure and be better at building it is to help government be a fairer and more consistent client for construction services. And in order to do that, we want standardization across not just contracts, but processes, design solutions, and a whole lot more. So my involvement with this has seen me quite heavily engaged with the construction sector Accord, the Accord, which is the partnership between government and the private sector, trying to improve the performance, and Natasha mentioned that earlier on, the construction sector Accord. And one of these is this project to update the NZS3910 contract. So the Accord in Te Waihanga facilitated the sector's wide range of participants on the back of those scoping meetings that Natasha talked to, and co-commissioned standards to undertake this review. And I'd just like to acknowledge the significant input that the NZIOB nominated representatives, the three other participants in this discussion, have had on this review project. The Institute's level of representation is unprecedented by standards. They've never had more than one representative before, and the efforts that the members have put in has been huge and absolutely vital in equal measure. So I'd like, I think as the Institute, we should really acknowledge the other three members of this panel for their efforts on our behalf. The Accord has worked with Crown client agencies to focus on special conditions, and the special conditions that various Crown agencies have large numbers and small numbers, and there's been work the Accord's done to really interrogate that and understand and really flush out the inconsistent use of special conditions and the numbers of special conditions that have been used, because a standard contract with pages and pages of special conditions soon becomes a bespoke contract, and that leads to a whole lot of inefficiencies and waste. So one of the most important objectives of this project is to significantly reduce the need for and use of special conditions. And the Accord has got agreement from all the Crown CEs to develop a all of government standard position and hopefully a very small set of special conditions once the review of the contract is completed. And they're also doing that same process with the CCCS, the consultants service agreement. They're developing a standard set of conditions to go on that and actually standardise contracting and make our systems and processes more streamlined. Other measures of success are fair and transparent risk allocation and the enabling of more collaborative relation-based approaches to contracting. And I think there's a lot of I guess challenge when you've got a transactional contract trying to introduce collaborative relation-based approaches, but there have been subtle little things that have been introduced. The talk first and fire off your claim second has really been a subtle little structural change that we've been able to introduce into the contract through the review. The review, government is very happy with, speaking from the Te Wāhanga's point of view, we're very happy with the way it's progressed and the contract that we've got out for consultation now. And as the others have said, we recommend that you have a look through. Very, very keen to get feedback through the standards portal. Thank you.
Great, thank you, John. And we understand that public consultation is available until June 30th, as you said, through the standards portal, which is consultations.standards.gobt.nz, and then you find the draft standard, the 3910. Just got a little piece here. When this was launched, I've got a piece here from November 2021. There was a quote from then co-chair of the Accord Steering Group talking about wanting to see a significant reduction in the use of special conditions. Does the draft achieve this, and would anyone like to speak to that? David?
I can have a go. Well, we don't know yet. Look, but one thing that we know, when we set out on this journey in February last year, we acknowledged right up front that we knew that principals and clients will be adding special conditions to the contract, and that's to reflect the various natures of their business, and that's reasonable. But what we have sought to do throughout the process is reduce their need to do that. And one of the ways that we did that was at the very early stages of the process, we compiled a great many of the special conditions that were gathered up, that were being written around the industry, and reviewed those to see, well, actually, what are people specialing, and trying to get an idea of why. We had lots of conversations about that. So we think that we have made changes that will certainly reduce the number of specials, but eliminate them? No, I don't think so.
And John, did you have a comment on that significant reduction?
Yeah, look, the committee has gone to great lengths to try and enable that to happen, but it is really up to the client at the end of the day. And my point about government and Te Wāhanga and the Accord pushing agencies to actually adopt standard special conditions is part of that. There is an expectation that there will be much reduced number of specials needed. The other thing we have done is introduced a few options into the contract so that stuff can be elected to be added in through the specific Schedule 1 rather than added as a special condition. But I started out by saying that was a key success indicator for me, and I got shouted down by everyone else in the very, very early meeting. It was never going to happen, but it'd be great if we could. And there is when the Accord was doing that research into the use of special conditions. There wasn't a local government entity that had about 3 special conditions in their standard contract, which I thought was pretty impressive.
Wow. Okay. And look, just a reminder for the Slido code for folks who are listening. Once you're in the Slido app or in your browser, your phone or your laptop, the number is 416-9979. That's 416-9979. And then you can get your questions through as well. Until then, it's all my questions, lucky me. Look, just a couple more on the original intention. I've also got a comment here from the same quote around risk transparency and allocation. Does anyone want to comment on where they think the draft has ended up in terms of being able to be more specific around where that risk sits? Have we made some steps or some progress, David?
I'm happy to answer, but I'm very happy for some of the others to jump in. My comment would be that yes, we definitely have. With transparency and trying to remove ambiguity is probably the biggest thing. One good example would be we haven't significantly changed the wording of the contract as it relates to contractors' design obligations, but we know that this is an area and cause of some real friction between contractors and principals. So we've made it clearer. You know, we've made it clearer by including in the first schedule a section on what are the contractors' design obligations, so it's transparent. And that we also think, and this is a request I'm making to all of the principals that have ears, is they have a higher obligation here to be really explicit about what contractor design obligations there are, including proprietary design. So, you know, there may be steel stud, maybe seismic ceilings, it could be a range of proprietary design responsibilities, rather than hiding it on page 473 of the contract specification. Stick it in the contract where the Johnnies of the world can find it without having to go searching. And so yeah, I think we have balanced things up, but we've just removed some of the ambiguity as well.
And I'll just add to that, Pam. The other thing that putting it explicitly in there does is it make it clear that even though NZS3910 is seen as a build-only contract, there are actually inherently design obligations, especially through the supply chain. And that's, you know, that having the design obligations clearly stated is a clear indication that there is design responsibility even in a build-only contract. Got
that. And Johnny, from a main contractor's perspective, is there anything you would add in there around how we've managed to make the risk more transparent and the risk allocation more clear?
Look, that was probably from our perspective the big one. One of the issues we have with this document, and we're never going to change it, is that it's so broad. It covers small jobs, massive jobs, as I said before. And also in very, very different complexities and all sorts of things. So there is always going to be a need for special conditions. But at least for special condition, the risk transfer is clearly seen. And I think also the collaborative approach of it too should also encourage those running the contract conditions and the special conditions to actually be mindful of that. And I think going forward, that is something we as an industry need to do and work out who is best placed to carry the risk. And if we as a main contractor are being asked to carry the risk, expect there's going to be a cost in that.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Now I'm going to ask a question about next steps. And David, I wonder if you can help me with this one. I'm sure other people watching today are interested to know when we'll be able to see a final version of the standard and correspondingly when we will expect this to come into effect. What would we be telling people on that?
Yep. Well, thanks, Pam. The consultation period, as you mentioned, closes on the 30th of June. Thereafter, the committee will be reviewing all of the comments, and we're expecting a lot, and we're hoping for a lot. There are some that I think we'll be discarding. There are others I'm certain that we'll be discussing in the committee and making amendments to the draft. Concurrently with that will be, once the draft content is finalised, there'll be what we call a plain language light review, which is about simplifying some of the language, not changing the content, just simplifying the language. And then it goes and gets ready for publication and release. And all going well, we're targeting release before Christmas. So the new standard, which I expect will be 3910/2023, will be released before Christmas. It's obviously not a mandatory standard. We don't expect, we'd love everybody to start using it right away, but time will tell.
Great. Okay, so our 2023 Christmas present is going to be the revised NZS3910, alongside a few other interesting industry launches. I believe we'll have the NZ Construction Industry Council, or CIC, design guidelines before the end of the year as well. Natasha, I just noticed you came off mute before. Did you want to add into that conversation about risk and transparency or anything else?
I was just picking up on one of the questions in Slido. So
yes.
If we wanted to go to them,
Sure.
there's a couple in there.
Was there something you were interested in answering?
Well, someone's asked the question, will the allowance of the CA and the IC to be the same person create the same independent issues that contractors currently have? I personally think one of the biggest issues that came out of the report, and that most people have, was for the engineer to be acting as the principal's expert advisor. And I think by removing that from the independent certifier role, that removes the inherent conflict of interest in the roles in the first place. I think it's unrealistic that for them not to be the same person, or able to be the same person, because of the smaller projects that use 3910. So then it comes down to the people using the contract and the level, I guess, of the project. I think on the larger projects, we're starting to see more mature clients asking for a separate engineer currently, and that's the role that I often do. This gives a much clearer role for that independent person in terms of the independent certifier. But as I said earlier, it also really clarifies the independent certifier's role as acting independently and impartially. So you also have to rely on the people doing the role, and they are, under the contract, they are required to, when they're making decisions or acting as the independent certifier, to act impartially and fairly. I guess if there was one point around that I will probably comment on in the feedback, is there's still a role for them to act as the principal. If I was being a purist, I would prefer for that not to be there. I would prefer for somebody else to be passing through the principal's deductions, whether that's the contract administrator or the principal's representative. To make that role truly independent, I think that's maybe some feedback that I'll probably be giving. But other than that, I think where we've gone to really solidifies that independence of that role. And because of the use of 3910 in many various sizes of contract, it's just not feasible to enforce for them to be separate people.
Okay. And there is another question sitting in Slido, which reflects when you spoke about the contract administrator and the independent certifier roles, you spoke of them as a natural person.
Yep.
Can you let us know what the situation is in terms of companies? Can it be a company, or it needs to be a singular person?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it's something that we would probably really like feedback on from the industry in terms of the contract administrator, because it is an administrative role issuing contract instructions. I think it's important that people know who they should be receiving instructions from and who that person is. But it will be it is more of a role set up for an organisation. So I think it is a good question. It's probably a really good thing for us to get feedback on as a committee. We have stuck with the natural person, and like I said, I think it's really important that people know this is the person I take instructions from, so there's no confusion. But I understand the requirement, given that role is probably going to not be at director level, for it to be covered as the company. So yeah.
Okay, great.
I don't know if David or John or Johnny have any comment on that, but
Look, I think we haven't got delegated authorities now. So there is a person who's responsible for that company's performance of the contract administration role. And the other thing I was just going to say about the independent certifier and the contract administrator split is that we went through the contract line by line, every clause that had the engineer responsible for something, and made sure that they were clearly split between those two distinct views, so that previously there were clauses in there that the engineer was making a decision but also looking after the client's interests in the same clause. So we've split those out, so there's no inherent conflicted issues in the new contract.
So we've reached our 45 minutes, but we do have 2 more questions in Slido. I think it's worth us just tapping into for the next 2 minutes. First of all, there are a couple of questions that are interested in the quality of the information supplied by consultants. Now, obviously, that's an interesting one in terms of that risk transfer process, but can anyone comment on how removing the lump sum pricing might reduce that risk to the main contractor and create more of that risk allocation towards the consultants to provide good information? Is that something Johnny might comment on?
Look, yeah, that's another perennial issue around just the quality of documentation we get. I would suggest that whoever is entering into the contract makes it very clear they understand where the contract documentation begins and finishes, and at what level it is, and clarify their tender or their bids accordingly, their contract documentation. But certainly, yeah, the fuller and more complete documentation is generally the better price the client's going to get. So for everyone sitting in the room that is working for the client, yeah, if you've got good documentation that's clear and concise, generally your price is going to reflect that. So yeah,
that might be something that the NZCIC guidelines update might help us with.
Yeah, I know we're working towards that, but as an industry, it's something we've got to do better.
Okay, well then the last question hopefully is fairly simple for whoever's familiar with this standard. Someone's asking about NZS3910 and asking if there's a flow on to update that piece, which is apparently 18 years old. Can anyone comment on the relationship from this to that?
Yeah, so the Accord and Te Waihanga are drafting a scoping document for standards to follow this up with the review of the remaining 391X suite of contracts and updating them all in accordance with the revisions that are being made in 3910. So that is a piece of work that is intended to happen following immediately.
That's good, because we need something to be able to celebrate next Christmas, right? Given that we've got quite a bit to launch before this side of Christmas, I think we will call it quits on this particular conversation, knowing that there are going to be lots more conversations. The next one is happening tomorrow, Tuesday, 23rd of May at 3 o'clock with the Accord and Te Waihanga. That consultation is happening through the consultations.standards.govt website. Certainly any of the Institute of Building members can get in touch with us, info@nziob.org.nz, and we're happy to compile a submission on your behalf. And the other thing I would say is thank you very much to our wonderful Institute of Building representatives who are living the NZS3910 journey, which is not quite over. We totally appreciate you representing the interests of a very broad group of people who all work very hard to deliver complex projects in that main contractor, design and project management space. So just before we say goodbye, I'd like to let you know that the next Industry Insights is on the 21st of June, midday, and that is with Rebecca DeChico, who is a leader in the Women in BIM movement and who was out here, was beamed in actually for our recent Building a Digital Community or Digicom conference, which was in March. So I want to say thank you very much to our wonderful guests today. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for representing the Institute and your good work. Ka kite anō.
Thank you.
Thanks.